As of just a few days ago, I made my full recovery from a nearly 4 month long on again, off again love affair with Dostoyevsky's Crime and Punishment, and today I'm here to tell the tale. Hi, if you don't know me, and you probably don't because this is my second video, my name is Maya and I'm Dostoyevsky's girl. As far as summaries go, here's what I've got for you. Raskolnikov is the main character, and he's a broke law student who recently had to drop out due to lack of funds. He does have a little bit of extra money that's being sent in to him from his mother and sister, although it's barely enough to get by. He's described to be literally wearing rags, and as we meet him, he's sneaking out of his apartment to avoid his landlady because he can't make rent and he hasn't made rent. And if he has to talk to her, he's going to have to make excuses and babble on, and he'd rather not do that. And where is he sneaking to? He actually is sneaking to a local pawnbroker who he's pawning his last worldly possessions to. And of course, he's upset at this situation. And with the little bit of money he has, he goes to a local pub and gets a beer. And he overhears a conversation that sticks in his mind. The conversation he overhears is between two men who are talking about this same lady with the same disdain that he has for her. And they are basically saying that it would be a net good for society if someone just killed her and gave her money to poor people. And Raskolnikov doesn't think this is a bad idea. It really resonates with him, and like I said, it sticks, but nothing comes of it for quite a while. All of this changes when Raskolnikov finally makes a decision that changes his life and in turn the rest of the book. By the end of part one, he not only murders the pawnbroker, but he murders her mentally disabled cousin, both with an axe. There's a lot of things that go his way and allows him to get out of the situation without being seen. But he really carries this guilt in the form of sickness. He's delirious and pale and sweating and can barely stay conscious. And people are starting to notice. Though Raskolnikov is in a rather desperate position at this point, he is not willing, and it's not his desire to receive help from anyone. He wants to be the person that provides the means for his life to get better and to change in a positive way. Not only his life, but also for his mother and his sister. But unfortunately for him at this point in time, he's not the only one that's realized the gravity of their financial situation and, having the knowing that something's got to give in order for things to change and to get better. His sister Donia recently comes into an opportunity to marry this wealthy lawyer by the name of Luzhin. And Raskolnikov is not happy about this because he knows that she doesn't love him. And he had recently met someone who's going to become of great consequence in his life later on by the name of Sonia, who unfortunately had a path where she had to become a prostitute in order to feed her family. And he doesn't want Donia to do what he believes is essentially the same thing for their family. It's here I want to introduce two characters that I believe are extremely integral to the plot, one being Marmeladov and the second being his daughter Sonia. Marmeladov is a former law clerk and alcoholic who Raskolnikov meets shortly after pawning all of his life's precious possessions. Marmeladov has a story to tell, and apparently he's always had a story to tell because all of the patrons in the bar, including the bartender themselves, seemed to be animated and laughing and ready for Marmeladov to go off on Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov, obviously unknowing, but somehow feeling like he needs to stay and listen, does so. And Marmeladov tells him a very terrible story about how he's essentially drank away all of his family's money, his wife is consumptive, and their children are starving. His daughter Sonia, who he brought into the marriage from a prior one, is a very smart girl who shouldn't have ended up in the situation she has, but essentially, because of her father, has become a prostitute in order to feed the family. Sonia is Marmeladov's eldest daughter, and she's had to make some sacrifices to feed the family. And because of them, she's not allowed to live with the family because she has a special, I believe they call it a yellow card, and that shows her status in society, which isn't a great one. But prior to this situation, she was a very intelligent girl who had great prospects in school, and she's extremely devout. This story obviously isn't a happy one, but it's a lasting one. And by the end of it, Marmeladov ends up convincing Raskolnikov to come to his home with his family, where he's kind of been avoiding for a few days, a few months. I can't remember exactly. And Raskolnikov does. And upon getting to their home, Marmeladov ends up getting hit by his wife, kind of slapped around, and Raskolnikov's like, I gotta get out of here, and he ends up leaving a small bag of money on the table. And after leaving, he's like, why did I do that? But definitely had a very lasting impression on him. So in his mind, all he has to do is get himself together and get away with murder. Not only one murder, but two. There's quite a lot of things that happen in between, but essentially by the end of the novel, he ends up turning himself in. There are a lot of quotations that ended up standing out to me, and I dictated them because they were so important, so I want to talk about a few. As Raskolnikov is reckoning with this idea, and he's getting to the point where he knows he's going to do this horrible thing, he has an inner monologue that really stuck out to me that I want to recite. He says, "Can it be? Can it be that I shall really take an axe? That I shall strike her on the head? Split her skull open? That I shall tread in the sticky warm blood? Break the lock? Steal and tremble? Hide all splattered in the blood with the axe? Good God, can it be?" And this was very poignant for me because he was very explicit in his plan. And hearing this, it wasn't shocking that a lot of people have nightmares as they read this book, because it is heinous, a lot of the thoughts that he's having, and unnatural. It's even unnatural to Raskolnikov himself, which is why he's having so much trouble carrying this out or even getting to the point of making this terrible decision. And the way he's able to rationalize this is he believes that this terrible woman who's taken advantage of so many people and their money and in turn kind of their lives, if he takes away her life and takes her wealth, it will be a net good for society. He's getting rid of evil. And there's also another quotation in this same vein that comes later that blew me away. He says, "Crime? What crime? That I killed a vile, noxious insect? An old pawnbroker woman of use to no one? Killing her was an atonement for 40 sins." And that was bold. He calls her a vile, noxious insect. Yeah. It becomes quite obvious to the reader that these rationalizations he's making are not rational, they're not logical, they're only rooted in his desire to have more money and to lead a better life, and he has to make these rationalizations in order to not go insane, but unfortunately he does end up going insane and becomes delirious, and people are worried about him, and it's pointing detectives in his direction, the suspicious activity and behavior. It's not good. The person that ends up being his moral compass and trying to steer him in a better direction is Sonia, and it's someone who he believes is depraved and, unworthy of feeling goodness in her life. He talks about these assessments that he's kind of made on Sonia. And he essentially says that she has three choices: the canal, which means throwing herself into the river; the madhouse, being institutionalized; or to sink further into depravity, which is continue her trajectory as a prostitute, but to be more mired in that lifestyle. Raskolnikov goes even further in his projections. He says this to Sonia: "Isn't it fearful that you're living in this filth which you loathe so? And at the same time, you know yourself. You've only to open your eyes that you are not helping anyone by it, not saving anyone from anything. Tell me how this shame and degradation can exist in you side by side with other, opposite, holy feelings. It would be better, 1,000 times better and wiser, to leap into the water and end it all." Through this quotation, it becomes even more clear that he's speaking to himself, though it's directed at Sonia. Sonia is doing what she's doing for a reason. She's feeding her family. Something has come of that. The children haven't died. Katerina hasn't died, at least not from starvation. And she responds to this quotation by saying, "But what would become of them?" So even in her despair, she's thinking of others, and she's very Christian, is God-fearing, and though she has to do what she does for a living, that's something that isn't her. However, Raskolnikov is becoming his crime in a way. He's just more and more wretched as the book goes on, and hateful and spiteful, and that feverishness really spreads itself through the length of this book. Reckoning with what he's done gets even worse for him when Sonia describes Lizaveta, who she describes as good, and she says she will see God. And Raskolnikov, in his mind, is thinking, she's a religious maniac. This is a direct quotation. And then he says, "I shall be a religious maniac myself soon. It's infectious," which is hilarious. Gotta give it to Dostoyevsky on that one. Raskolnikov goes on to say, "You too have transgressed, have had the strength to transgress. You have laid eyes on yourself. You have destroyed a life, your own." And again, like I said, it's acting as a mirror. The famous quotation that led me to read this book is, "Your greatest sin is that you've destroyed and betrayed yourself, and it was all for nothing." And this quotation is actually said by Raskolnikov himself, and it's directed at Sonia. He's saying this very hateful and disdainful thing at Sonia. This is how he feels about himself, because nothing good came of this terrible act. He stole some petty things that didn't really result in him having a come up from this murder and theft. And it was all for nothing. And he's destroyed and betrayed himself, his morals, his ideals, and who he wanted to be in life. This had nothing to do with his life's trajectory. I saw in a little bit of research that I did today that the name Raskolnikov is derived from a Russian word that means schism. So we are effectually meant to be thinking about the duality of man, the duality of Raskolnikov. And in the beginning, I wouldn't say that I thought him to be a bad person or a morally incongruent person, but you see what it takes to get there, and those different things, the things that he has to ignore or put aside in order to carry out the murder, are resulting in a lot of little dualities. Okay, I gotta start walking because it's getting dark, but I really wanted to talk about what even called me to make this video, because like I said, I didn't know if I was going to make it. A few days have passed, and I had already struggled so much with this book, but it was actually because of Hank Green's new podcast, Humans. And of course, his brother, John Green, was his very first guest, and they had a conversation that was really lasting for me. And specifically, John Green was talking about, well, I think they were asking each other about love and what that is. And John had essentially said that it's his belief that we are all worthy of compassion and forgiveness. And maybe that's not exactly love, but it's something like it. And that's just me paraphrasing. That's not a direct quotation, but I do have some more direct quotations written from that. And so John goes on, he was talking about tuberculosis and the severity of that disease. He does a lot of work with that. He wrote a book called Everything is Tuberculosis, which is absolutely incredible, and I cannot recommend that more. That's the only nonfiction book that I've ever read and cried while reading. It was extremely moving and educational. That's my sidebar on that one. But he quoted somebody who also did some studies on tuberculosis by the name of Paul Farmer. And Paul Farmer said, almost everything that's wrong about the world is wrong with the world is because we fail to acknowledge that all human lives have equal value. And I thought about this in terms of the pawnbroker. Who was Raskolnikov to say that she wasn't worthy of life, that she wasn't worthy of compassion? He didn't question why she did what she did and what was really in it for her, or what her life looked like, who she loved, who she knew, anything like that. He had just made a ruling that she wasn't worthy of life anymore and that he needed to take it and take her possessions along with that. And I think we rationalize a lot why people have wasted away their lives or haven't done any good with them, but that's not our decision to make. And in fact, John says this. He says, in my faith tradition, I'm specifically told that whenever I see a prisoner, I see God. I see the light and love of God himself. And that obviously really stood out to me because I had been thinking about Raskolnikov and his fate becoming a prisoner in Siberia. In our culture, do we think that murderers are deserving of love and compassion? No, we don't, not naturally. And in John talking about his exercise in compassion, something I would describe as extreme compassion for people, and to see love and light and God in others and know that they are worthy of love and worthy of life, is a revolutionary act to me. John goes on to say, I have to bring that. Like, these people are worthy of love and care and forgiveness in the world, and what they did or didn't do isn't relevant to the question of that worthiness. And I think this is a large part of what Dostoyevsky is trying to say in Crime and Punishment, is that we are not the ones to make the judgments, but we are the ones to approach with love, with compassion, and with understanding. And I do think we obviously are imperfect beings, and we're not always going to be as compassionate as we should be or sympathetic as we should be. But it's that knowing that sets us apart, is knowing that we should, and knowing that others are worthy of it. Theorizing on what life on Earth would be like if even 20% more people did that. I think we could see so much more goodness. I want to shout out my favorite podcast, Classical Stuff You Should Know. They made a 2-part podcast on Crime and Punishment. I hope they make a third on the epilogue and analysis, but they were the ones, having done that, just encouraged me to get back to the book because I was taking really long pauses and was just having a really hard time, as I've said a million times by now. but they are an incredible resource and have such thoughtful episodes that they put together on different classical books and classical stuff you should know. So definitely check them out if you have an opportunity. This concludes my video on Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a like. If you have something to say, please comment. I would love to respond to anyone. Just obviously keep it respectful. But yeah, I'm really excited to continue this journey making videos about books, and I really hope you follow along.
Have you read Crime and Punishment by Dostoyevsky?
No, I haven't.
I have.